better than powdered blackness, I think. It's also very messy. I asked my friend Fiaster what he thought about this topic, just to like, he was like, what, they're bottling our shit now? They, and you of all people, you're gonna go down there and talk about this? For Theaster and I, as well as Darby English, who's recently taken this consulting gig over at MoMA, we always laugh about. Thelma Golden referred to us as a generation of part-time black men. It just cracks Darby English and I up, so far as we aren't African Americans, with respect to our forays off into the topic of race. So I'm going to begin, it's two parts, a very short written part, which will begin with a section from the prologue, Ralph Ellett, the prologue for The Invisible Man, which is where the title Black Is Black Ink comes from, where I think pretty much the dilemma, as it were, was spelled out with this book's publication. And then I'll read a very short prologue of my own to an essay that I wrote for Freestyle, which was Thelma Golden's 1999 exhibition, in which she posited a kind of generation of young black artists who were pretty much under the sway of pluralism. They could be, you're free to be you and me, do whatever you want. You are not obligated in any way whatsoever to address the topic of race. And the exhibition came out of 10 years after Freestyle. I found myself asking, well, Thelma, where does that leave the topic of race? It's not as if it's left. So the thing that I've written for this is something of a set of reflections about earlier reminiscences on the topic of race, getting it somewhere in the tween years. But in doing the exhibition, probably the most important thing was to think of race as a playful space, which is probably the thing that I think of as the most, what would mark it, or mark a distinction from a past. To think of it not so much in terms of, victimhood or celebration, which seems to be the terms between which, exhibitions would oscillate, nor could an exhibition of all black artists substitute for one about race, especially by 2008. And again, thinking about it as the flip side of the coin that Thelma Golden's freestyle, in some sense. But mainly as a space for me to share my own confusion. So this is The Invisible Man. So under the spell of the reefer, I discovered a new analytical way of listening to music. The unheard sounds came through, and each melodic line existed of itself, stood out clearly from all the rest, said its piece, and waited patiently for the other voices to speak. That night, I found myself hearing not only in time, but in space as well. I not only entered the music, but descended, like Dante, into its depths. And beneath the swiftness of the hot tempo, there was a slower tempo, and a cave, and I entered it, and looked around, and heard an old woman singing a spiritual, as full of Weltschmerz as flamenco. And beneath that lay a still lower level, on which I saw a beautiful girl, the color of ivory, pleading in a voice like my mother's, as she stood before a group of slave owners who bid for her naked body. And below that, I found a lower level and a more rapid tempo. And I heard someone shout, "Brothers and sisters, my text this morning is the blackness of blackness." And the congregation of voices answered, "That blackness is most black, brother, most black." In the beginning, at the very start, they cried, there was blackness. Preaching. And the sun, Lord, was bloody red. Red. Now black is, the preacher shouted. bloody. I said, black is. Preach it, brother. And black ain't. Red, Lord red. He said it's red. Amen, brother. Black will get you. Yes, it will. Yes, it will. And black won't. No, it won't. It do. It do, Lord. And it don't. Hallelujah. It'll put you glory, glory, oh my Lord, in the whale's belly. Preach it, dear brother, and make you tempt, good God Almighty, good God Almighty, old Aunt Nellie. Black will make you black, or black will unmake you. Ain't it the truth, Lord? The year was 1980. I was 14 years old, a freshman at the Baltimore Polytechnic Institute, a magnet high school with an emphasis in math, science, and engineering-related vocations. We were a class of roughly 30 students. Mr. Williams, my 9th grade social studies teacher, was normally gregarious and outgoing. But I remember a day when he was conspicuously disengaged. He was dummy to a chart whose subject, race, lent it the powers of ventriloquism. He delivered his lesson plan in utterly bloodless fashion. His lips moved somewhere inside his beard. The monotone recitation continued, unabated, despite rashes of giggling. Negroid, Caucasoid, Mongoloid were terms in which it was impossible for us to see ourselves. Negro, Caucasian, and Mongol were silly enough without the void. Being either hopelessly dated or too formal, they did not refer to anyone going by black, white, or oriental, as the designation Asian had yet to carry favor. Polygenism, with its version of a black Adam and Eve, a white Adam and Eve, an Asian Adam and Eve, and a Native American Adam and Eve, which doubled as the Hispanic Adam and Eve, had been roundly debunked. Somebody's got to do double time. Yet the now commonly accepted out of Africa theory, which confirmed Darwin's hypothesis of monogenesis, had not gained traction in the Baltimore City public school curriculum. Any notion of a common ancestral population was altogether eclipsed by a diagram that began with the big three and quickly devolved into subgroupings, which, based on the standard choices for self-identification, belonged to the catch-all category other. We did not have questions, which is to say, we did not openly question the material. Had we known of the diagram's checkered past with a cast of characters that includes the likes of author de Gobineau, a French man of letters who invented the theory of an Aryan race, class would have been an entirely different scenario, one of which Mr. Williams would pray parents did not get wind. The lesson was thoroughly confusing. Like a rabbit duck drawing, it could be either science or history, depending on how you looked at it. Since he spoke in terms of archetypes rather than people, I took it as science. From 3 archetypes came a host of subcategories that implied migration and miscegenation. Calling them archetypes, however, was supposed to eclipse questions of their existence in and over time, questions bound to invoke history, mythical, biblical, or otherwise. My image of a Mongolian Adam and Eve was clearly beside the point. The chart, as is, was the point. Parsing and labeling variations on the theme of humanity was an end in itself. It took a lot of work for me to figure out that the chart was simply a hollow system for managing difference. End of story. Discussing race in purely formal terms is an exercise in alienation, if ever there were one. A case in point being Mr. Williams' disengagement. Between race and sex, I'm sure he would have opted for explaining to us the latter fact of life. In essence, Mr. Williams bore the onus of breaking the news to us that race was not a natural, but an historical construction, a social construction, and as such, could be entertained as fiction. Mr. Williams, however, would never have been so bold. He was a prisoner of context. In 1980, it would have been hard to imagine a black teacher announcing to a class of 14-year-olds, the majority of whom were likewise black, that race was a fiction. To declare race a fiction would have been radical relative to the black political and cultural self-consciousness that emerged in the preceding 2 decades. While the rhetoric of black nationalism may have been waning by 1980, you have to keep in perspective that it was only 4 years before, in 1976, that African American Week, as envisioned by Carter G. Woodson 50 years earlier, was embraced at a national level and expanded to encompass the month of February. Or that 1 year later, 1977, saw the airing of the television miniseries Roots, an event that many, myself included, considered epic. Or, as a biographical exercise, I could contrast Mr. Williams, my high school social studies teacher, to Miss Quarles, my middle school social studies teacher, a young soul sister with the dashikis, afro. Miss Quarles, I remember, had to come up on stage and relieve me of my task of lighting the 7 candles of Kwanzaa as I was stricken with a case of stage fright. My hands have never shaken like that. I let Miss Quarles down. She wanted to reinforce the initiative shown by my parents in naming me Hamza. She wanted to back that African-sounding name up with symbolic ritual, build a solid foundation for self and belonging. According to Ms. Quarles, my lot was cast with all the Shaniquas, the Taywans, the Kenyatas. But what started as a simple exercise in pride and uplift quickly became a 10-year-old boy's failure to the race. A Charlie Brown complex. Part-time black man in the making. I believe that children are the future. Teach them well, let them lead the way. Show them all the beauty they possess inside. Give them a sense of pride to make it easier. But I digress. The point I want to make, Whitney, the point I want to make is that Mr. Williams' lesson had to compete with the still potent sentiment of cultural self-determination. Obviously, say it loud, I'm Negroid and I'm proud, didn't cut it. Explaining race in the manner required of Mr. Williams was in some sense the equivalent of teaching ornithology to birds. But that said, teaching race with only the vaguest of implications that it was a social construction was progressive then. Fraught with whatever problems this lesson plan, inconceivable under Jim Crow era segregation, fraught with whatever problems this lesson plan, inconceivable under Jim Crow era segregation, was developed in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. Moreover, the social studies framework was part of a discourse. In biology, we were learning about phenotype, genotype, and the nature and transmission of genetic traits. In American history, race was discussed as central to the nation's socio-political evolution toward a colorblind society, an ideology on which we, as post-civil rights children, were weaned. Our earliest memories were formed well in the wake of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, which abruptly ended the civil rights movement. The subsequent riots testified to the depth of frustration and anger that hope had kept in check. Expectations stood in stark contrast to reality, creating a chasm between present and future which only ideology could bridge. As the first generation of post-civil rights children, we were weaned on the ideology of colorblindness, which, in according human beings' equal physical and mental capacity, dispelled notions of biological determinism. Differences were said to be skin deep, and therefore no differences at all. We laughed at the terms Negroid, Caucasoid, and Mongoloid, in part because they fell on colorblind ears. By 9th grade, however, We understood ourselves as subjects that had been racialized in a manner so thoroughly historically determined as to function at an unconscious level, that in turn doubled as its own kind of essentialism. Race was a fact as self-evident as our being. A time when race was not operative was beyond the powers of an imagination, the center of which was the black hole of middle passage. And this is an aside. Sun Ra journeyed into this black hole precisely to disable race. I suspect it is for this reason that I've never met anyone black who did not fundamentally understand his project. An understanding which has nothing to do with music, no matter how supposedly out the music may sound. You know, which I think is very, very interesting. This idea, Sun Ra's claim of being from Saturn, not being race as a riddle. In Sun Ra, the way that my father was a musician, so it's very interesting the way that, you know, his project as a whole, you know, and not necessarily the music is what was more important in a way. When I think about the way that the other musicians would talk about him, or even people just on the street, like Sun Ra, that crazy dude who thinks he's from Saturn. Yeah, I understand. You know? So that's an aside. Race was a fact as self-evident as our being. A time when race was not operative was beyond the powers of an imagination, the center of which was the black hole of middle passage. Race is a set of phenotypical differences. We knew that. We also knew that what race is cannot necessarily be dissociated from what race means. This was apparent from the outset. This was apparent from the outset of class, as the obvious parallel between Negroid and black was drawn. Although Negroid referred to a set of features making up the spectrum of people known as black, there was a tacit part of the equation. We did not know about the one-drop rule and hyperdescent, but we knew that being counted as black meant you could not be counted as white. We were marked. Black was not simply a set of features in and of itself. Those features designated you as belonging to one group, which by default excluded you from belonging to another. The hierarchical relationship between black and white made race a value system, one that structured our reality and sense of self in such fundamental fashion that asking a racialized subject what race is, independent of the social order that gives race meaning, could rightfully seem absurd. Race was a fact as self-evident as our being, its meaning derived from the value accorded to difference. That value, in turn, served as the basis of a fate and an identity over which black subjects were not masters until relatively recently. Civil rights. For the greater part of history, the dominant conclusion was that blacks were inferior, whether deduced through bogus biological science or deduced empirically by pointing to the ghetto, a socially engineered destitution whose machinations are historically rooted to the extent that their present-day effects are routinely mistaken for causes in their own right. In 1980, at age 14, our understanding of race was a highly heterogeneous mix of ideas and ideologies of which school played an important part. Self-determination was weighed against embryonic but no less crucial nuggets of anti-essentialist thinking. Looking back at that moment makes me ask, how do we know race? How do we teach race? Is it something we want to learn, or is it something better thought of in terms of its unlearning? So now I'd like to talk about the exhibition. So is there...
Yeah, is it doing my best with